The DJI Osmo Pocket 3 is everywhere right now, and I think there's a good reason for it. This might just be the best compact little camera that you can buy at the moment. And that is why there are countless videos, reels, articles, reviews, all of it talking about this camera. I picked it up at the back end of last year in an attempt to make my life easier when shooting YouTube content and for social media content in general. And today I want to share my first impressions, what I've learnt so far, and how I plan to utilize this great little tool going forwards. Now I am going to share some specs throughout the video about the Osmo Pocket 3, but I'm not going to deep dive into every single little feature that this camera has because, to be honest, it's got more great features than I actually need to use and that I plan to use. But I'm also going to talk about its use in my current workflow. The big thing I always think with a camera review or a first impressions video is that the image that it produces and how practically efficient it is at capturing that image is the most important thing. So I'm going to start off this video just by sharing some footage that I've shot with this camera, and in all of these situations I literally just took the Pocket 3 simply in my jacket pocket and pulled it out when I saw something that I wanted to film. Take a look at this and then we'll dive into some of my favorite features that I've utilized thus far. So hopefully you can see there, the image quality of this little camera is incredibly impressive, particularly for the price at which you can get it. Right now it is £489 on DJI's website, or you can opt for a couple of different bundles. I personally went with the creator combo, which is £619 and gives you some great extras like a DJI Mic 2 transmitter, an extended battery handle, a mini tripod, a wide angle lens adapter, and a great carrying bag to store all of this in. And for £619 or £489 at its base level, you're getting a seriously impressive image. Although I will say in that sequence I did obviously cheat just a little bit. It's fairly heavily color graded. I've utilized film emulation plugins and spent a fair bit of time trying to create a look that I'm happy with. That isn't the exact image that you're going to get straight off the bat when using the Pocket 3. And I think a lot of people will be purchasing this for a more plug and play type scenario, and it certainly seemed to gain a lot of attraction for content creators in all sorts of different genres that possibly are not coming from video related backgrounds. So I am going to show some of that footage that I shared earlier, some ungraded and some simply converted to Rec 709 to give you an idea of the true image that comes out with little to no work. Whilst I do that, I'll talk about a few basic video specs. The Osmo Pocket 3 has a 1-inch CMOS sensor capable of recording up to 4K UHD, so a resolution of 3840 by 2160, and it can shoot up to 120 frames per second in that resolution, which is wildly impressive. Although, just to note, that can only be used in the slow motion mode of the camera. It can, of course, do your standard 24, 25 or 30 frames per second, as well as 48, 50 and 60 frames per second for higher frame rate footage. The max video bitrate is 130 megabits per second, and it records in H.264 and HEVC MP4 format onto a microSD up to 512 gigabytes. The camera itself is of course a mechanically stabilized 3-axis gimbal, so it can provide some incredibly steady footage, even when walking with the camera just in your hand. There are some minor bumps present of course, but nothing that your editing software's stabilization effects can't remove fairly easily. The lens is a 20mm focal length with an aperture of f2.0, and it has full pixel fast focusing, which should help you get sharp footage at all times. The Pocket 3 is capable of recording 10-bit footage when recording in H.264 file format, and it utilizes DJI's D-Log-M color space, which allows for the camera to record 1 billion colors and a quoted 12.7 stops of dynamic range. Impressive for such a small sensor and camera. The camera can record over 2 hours of footage on a single charge and can be quickly charged up to a level of 80% in just 16 minutes. I've personally never really run into any battery issues, particularly when using the extended battery handle, and so I don't think that should ever be a huge issue. And because of all those specs, the camera could realistically be used in a lot of different scenarios. As I said, I purchased this to make my YouTube content creation easier. It's great for that because it is so small, lightweight, and portable, but can provide a great image for B-roll shots and sequences of talking to camera whilst out and about creating photographs. The built-in mic receiver and added mic transmitter that comes with the Creator Combo is perfect for those run and gun video clips that I want to start getting more of with my photography focused videos in particular. If I point this, I'm pointing this literally just at the scene. I'm not blocking anything. In formats, I'm shooting with my Pentax 6.7, which obviously doesn't have a light meter built in, but even just for capturing clips of the frames that I'm going to photograph, the stereo microphones that are included in the camera still do a pretty good job. But it doesn't really stop there. With some good lighting, this thing could be a perfectly usable A-roll talking head setup like the one that I'm shooting right now. It could also get some great B-roll and product shots for my YouTube channel if I wanted it to. And overall, the image quality is really great. I find it fairly flexible to color grade and to tweak how I like. It's not a full-on log profile like S-Log3 in my Sony, and you won't be able to extract quite as much dynamic range from the sensor as you can in those higher-end cameras, but the image is more than usable and really quite good actually for social media designated content in particular. That is only going to get compressed when it gets uploaded online anyway. But I think what stood out to me about this camera so far is just how easy it is to get a great looking image. From a usability standpoint, this camera is so incredibly simple. It has a 2-inch rotating OLED touchscreen, which has a brightness of 700 nits. Not the brightest, but perfectly usable still outside, and only in the bright sun do I think you would really struggle. It weighs just 179 grams in its base configuration, and it's only 13 centimeters tall. So this thing is seriously tiny. I own a Blackmagic Pocket cinema camera, and clearly the Pocket in that name is in comparison to the vast majority of cinema level cameras that can get that image quality, but DJI made this Osmo Pocket 3 quite literally a pocketable camera. Whilst it is a tiny bit tall to fit in jean pockets or any tighter pockets, and I'd be wary of doing that anyways, this thing is hardly noticeable if you put it in a jacket pocket. It clearly takes up no room in a bag, and it's incredibly easy to take with you almost everywhere that you go. The included little protective carrying cover is also great for protecting the lens and also for storing useful accessories like magnetic ND filters. Flipping the screen around to turn it on and off is surprisingly satisfying, and it hasn't gotten old yet, and the menu system is actually fairly intuitive. Although I have pretty clumsy and not particularly dexterous fingers, and so the swipe motions do sometimes take a couple of attempts to get right. The screen shows all of your basic info that you need to know when you're shooting: your battery life, space left on your card, your basic exposure level, and what format of video it is that you're shooting in. You can control the gimbal with the small joystick and hit the record button, and that's pretty much it for tactile buttons. It is super simple, it tells you everything that you need to know, and can be carried around almost everywhere with you. It's definitely one of the easiest cameras that I've ever used, so definitely a huge plus on the practicality standpoint. Now, of course, it can't all be perfect, particularly at this lower price point, and so there are some little gripes and a few issues that I have discovered whilst using the camera so far. The first one is a lack of exposure tools and assists. Now, obviously this is a tiny little camera with a small little screen, and so packing any sort of histogram or waveform on that screen is not particularly realistic. However, I'd love to have the option of just some form of exposure tool, and I think my main wish would be the ability to have zebras on the camera. This camera for me needs as much light as possible to get a clean image and the most workable when it comes to color grading, and so personally I found the best results by slightly overexposing the image. With zebras it would be far easier to do this whilst being being comfortable that I'm not blowing out any of my highlights and that highlight detail information, which for me is one of the biggest tells of a lower price and lower quality camera and image, having those blown out highlights. Another thing that slightly annoys me at times can be the focus. It can hunt just a little bit or be a little bit too reactive to things, and you notice a sort of quick wobble or readjustment on the side of the frame as it quickly tries to change its focus point. I'd personally prefer a slower reaction and a slightly smoother change in focus point, or maybe the ability to change that in a setting, how quickly it reacts. That gripe is not super noticeable, and maybe is only because I've now been looking for it since noticing it, but it is something that I've seen. Again, these are features that generally come on much more expensive cameras. Also, as lovely as the little rotating 2-inch screen is, I do wish that when recording in D-Log-M there was some sort of display assist that converted it back to Rec. 709, because I personally find the image to just be a little bit too flat to get a 100% accurate exposure and composition and to clearly see what the camera is focusing on, particularly if you're in bright conditions with that 700 nit screen. As I said, it's not nearly as flat of a log profile as in the higher end cameras, but I would still prefer to see a Rec. 709 or just slightly adjusted preview. And finally, I would love to lower the sharpening settings even more if I could. I don't know if the -2 that you set it to means that absolutely no sharpening is done in camera, but for me the footage is still just a little bit too crisp and digitally sharp at times. And I know that's sort of just a product of a 1-inch sensor, but I'd love to get a slightly more organic looking image if you could. DJI does sell a black mist filter that could help with that fact, and so maybe I'll have to pick one up to try out in the near future. And that's really it for my issues that I've discovered so far, and really at the price point that this camera is, they're all more than understandable as features that are just a little bit lacking. So let's round this up by just talking about how I would set up this little camera to get the best looking results. My biggest tips that I would give in regards to how to get the best footage out of this camera are as follows. Spend some time really getting to know the basic video settings and read the manual of the camera as well. Whilst you can use this camera completely automatically, using it in the pro and manual mode will get you much better results. I would always shoot in 4K and make sure that you're recording in H.264 to ensure that you get the least compressed footage and take advantage of the 10-bit capabilities. I'd change the color mode to D-Log-M in your image adjustments tab, set your sharpness to -2 and noise reduction also to -2 or -1, just to avoid that really digitally sharp and, in my opinion, slightly inferior look. Just as a note, when editing this footage, you will need to convert that D-Log-M footage to a Rec. 709 in order to get a correct and standard looking image, and DJI has a LUT on their site that you can apply to the footage in the editing software of your choice. It's always helpful to familiarize yourself with the exposure triangle to understand how settings such as ISO, aperture, and shutter speed affect how bright or dark your image is. But for this camera, the first thing that I would set is your shutter speed. If you're filming regular motion, your frames per second is either going to be 24, 25, or 30. Your shutter speed should almost always be double this amount to get natural looking footage. So swipe right on the main screen, change the exposure setting to manual, and set your shutter speed to 1/50th if you're shooting 24 or 25 frames per second, and 1/60th if you're shooting 30 frames per second. Aperture is fixed on this camera, and so you cannot change that, and so the last setting that you can tweak to get proper exposure is your ISO. One great feature of the Pocket 3 that I love is that it comes with the ability to shoot in an ISO range and have the camera determine the ISO for your scene without going outside of that specified range. Personally, I do find this quite useful, and I often set this to the ISO 50 to 400 range. Anything over ISO 400 I find adds quite a lot of extra noise, and even in that range I try and keep it at 200 or below if I can. Whilst working in this auto ISO range, you can then set some exposure compensation settings to get your desired look. I tend to leave this at 0 or at plus a third of a stop depending on the situation. If at plus 0.3 I can see on my screen that the highlights of the image look incredibly bright, I'll turn this back to 0 or even -0.3, because in my personal opinion, blown out highlights that aren't done for a creative reason are one of the main indicators of a slightly cheaper and lower quality image, with plenty of noise being probably the second biggest tell following closely behind. Those base settings are going to be usable for a lot of daytime scenarios, but because of the fixed aperture lens, you will need a set of magnetic ND filters to attach to the front of the lens when working in bright conditions. I picked up a set from K&F because annoyingly the DJI filters when on the camera lens means that the camera can't close properly when it turns off and automatically shuts off the lens. The filter is just too big and so it doesn't shut. I've personally had no issues with the K&F ones. I like to use manual white balance and change this myself, but if you're fairly new to the idea of Kelvin and of white balance in general, you absolutely can use this on auto and get some good results. A good little tip as well is that on automatic mode, it actually tells you what Kelvin the camera sets itself to. So if you don't want to deal with changing white balance in one area and you want it locked in, set your camera to auto white balance, see what Kelvin it recommends, and then if you change it to manual, it will lock in that white balance and it won't automatically update. Those are all the settings that I personally use on the camera, and it's what allows me to get some great looking footage, but it's certainly not a plug and play situation still. If the ISO is too high in the automatic range, I'll remove ND to get to the lowest ISO, or even try and add some lights. If the ISO is at the lowest level and the image looks too bright, I'll obviously add some ND filters to the front of the lens and find the balance that looks the best. And the main thing that I really do is look at the image on the back of the screen and see what it looks like. That's my main process with the majority of cameras that I use. As I said earlier, there's a big lack of exposure tools in this camera, and the D-Log-M preview is not always a great one, but it is still pretty easy to see when the image looks too over or underexposed, and the EV values that the camera gives is normally pretty accurate. So aim for that to be around 0 or plus 0.3. Overall though, I really do absolutely love this camera, and it is only going to help me create more content. It's not as good an image as my Sony or my Blackmagic camera, and you wouldn't expect it to be for the price and the form factor. But what it lacks in image quality compared to these much higher end camera systems, it more than makes up for with its practicality. That is going to be all for this one though. I'm excited to use the Osmo Pocket 3 going forwards, particularly for photo trips and more videos here on the channel. If you've got a Pocket 3, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it down in the comments section, and if you found the video helpful at all, please do consider leaving me a like and maybe subscribe if you do want to see any more of my content going forwards. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.